Homework, wow. Deliberate or non-deliberate handling or acceptance of institutional procedures qualifying for a home mortgage, unfair hiring practice, inequitable admissions, and criteria that have unjustly limited the opportunities of certain groups of people of color. A term used to designate groups that are non-white. Race, socially constructed category that denotes differences. Race, socially constructed category that denotes differences among people and is politically sustained to assign people to categories. Racialization. 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 Processes by which racial meanings are attached to particular issues and the manner in which race appears to be a key factor in the ways they are defined. And the manner in which race appears to be a key factor in the ways they are defined and understood. Racism process whereby socialized racist notions become integrated with actions and practices in such a way that these actions and practices become actualized and reinforced through routine situations. Structural theory explains racism as a byproduct of economic, political, and social forces' actions upon race and ethnicity. So that's to read chapter 4 and chapter 6. So chapter 6 I will now get water. That was funny. Whoops, you were able to hear me say wow in a weird voice. What is it? Why does it say Shonda L. Scott and Terrence R. McLean? Are those the people who wrote the chapter? So we're on page 107, and we have to read to page 117. So basically just 10. It's not bad. Shut up. The complexity of the concept of identity confounds the interactions that we as humans have with one another. In reality, we are not one-dimensional, but multi-dimensional beings. Individual characteristics, family dynamics, historical factors, and social and political context all influence who we believe ourselves to be. In this chapter, we examine ethnicity as a separate construct from race, although related to it, along with how it impacts the workforce. Although there are other dimensions of our being that also blend with our race and ethnicity, make up our total being: gender, age, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, abilities versus disabilities, and religious or spiritual beliefs. Ethnicity is understood as a group of people who share a culture, nationality, ancestry, and or language. And physical appearance is not associated with ethnicity. Culture, nationality, ancestry, and language. This chapter begins with a discussion of how ethnicity differs from race, followed by a discussion on how ethnicity is determined in the United States and how it is used to categorize ethnic groups. Next, discrimination against ethnic. I'm not going to read this chapter. Learning outcomes, or the learning outcomes. Yeah. Ethnicity and race. Ethnicity and race. A discussion on ethnicity in the workforce cannot begin with the definition of ethnicity and how it differs from race. Ethnicity is the product of actions undertaken. What? Ethnicity is the product of actions undertaken by ethnic groups as they shape and reshape their self-definition and culture. However, ethnicity is also constructed by external social, economic, and political processes and actors as they shape and reshape their ethnic categories and definitions. Ethnic groups are identified in relation to the dominant culture. National origin and distinctive cultural patterns encompassing language, religious faith, shared traditions, values, symbols, literature, music, and food habits are some of the distinctive characteristics that set groups apart. There are distinctions between ethnic groups. There are distinctions between ethnic groups expressed There are distinctions between ethnic groups expressed in language, religion, race, kinship, and geographical isolation. Ethnicity is revealed when people claim a certain identity for themselves and are defined by others as having that identity. Ethnicity is an expression of collective identity that represents attachment to a group and its associated behaviors, which can vary in intensity. Ethnicity is also an expression of personal identity. Although self-expression is important, it is not the only salient component of identity. It's argued that there is no such thing as unilateral ethnicity. What does that even mean? Only a construct influenced by ethnic relations between those groups of people who appear to be the same with others who appear to be different. Therefore, it cannot be assumed that all people within a particular group are exactly the same as another group. Apparent cultural similarities do not influence ethnicity within group differentiation. Ethnicity is not a matter of definable degrees or obvious kinds of cultural similarity or difference. There is no checklist with which to determine whether or not members of Group A are really ethnically different to members of Group B, or whether Group C is an ethnic group or some other kind of collectivity. Enumerating cultural traits or characteristics is not a useful way to understand or identify ethnic differences. Human beings are distinguished by their voices, and the baseline is always whether a group is seen by its members to be different. Race generally represents a group of people who share similar physical characteristics, color, hair texture, facial features, etc., and a common historical background. And a common historical background. The historical shaping of the concept of race sheds deeper insight on its present practical application. The idea of race began to take shape with the rise of a world political economy. The onset of global economic integration, the dawn of seaborne empire, and the conquest of the Americas and the rise of the Atlantic slave trade were all key elements in the genealogy of race. The concept emerged over time as a kind of world historical bricolage. What the heck does that even mean? And a creative process that was in part theoretical, but much more essentially practical. Though intimated throughout the world in innumerable ways, racial categorization of human beings was a European invention. It was an outcome of the same world historical processes that created European nation-states and empires, built the dark satanic mills of Britain and the even more dark and satanic sugar mills of the Brazilian, Reconcavo, and the Caribbean, and explained it all by means of Enlightenment rationality. In the United States, race is often confused with ethnicity because of the lack of a clear distinction between the two. For example, the term Hispanic is an ethnic category that cross-cuts racial contrast between black and white. In other words, a person who is Hispanic can be perceived as white or black depending on the hue of their skin tone. Race is also political. The United States racial classification is a politicized system that determines access to resources, including jobs, voting districts, and federal funding of programs, often having the effect of controlling and limiting opportunities for minorities. This classification ascribes status onto people based on their perceived ethnic group affiliation. People of mixed race experience hypodescent, which automatically places them into the minority group regardless of physical appearance. Before discussing ethnicity in the United States, you must first understand American culture and how it affects ethnic identity. Culture is a system of human behavior and thought. Culture is a system of human behavior and thought that is not acquired by biological inheritance, but by growing up in a particular society where exposure to specific cultural traditions, knowledge, beliefs, art, morals, laws, customs, habits, symbols are learned and shared by individuals as members of a group. Ethnic groups then are groups of people who share certain beliefs, values, habits, customs, and norms because of their common background. The common background in an ethnic group may include a collective name, belief in common descent, a sense of solidarity, and an association with a specific territory which the group may or may not hold. In the United States, ethnicity can be treated as a subculture, minority group, or subordinate group based on different and shared learning experiences within the larger culture. For example, people may show loyalty to their neighborhood, school, and religion and still participate in broader cultural activities such as voting in federal elections. before Christopher Columbus arrived, the country that became the United States was already ethnically mixed. Native American tribes were societies of people with different languages, religions, and political systems. The arrival of Europeans, Africans, Chinese, and others only added to the ethnic variations already in existence. What sets ethnic groups apart is their national origin or distinctive cultural patterns. Over time, cultural patterns are introduced into other ethnic groups that cross perceived racial lines, making ethnic groups more difficult to classify. For example, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, and other Latin Americans are grouped together as Hispanic or Latino, although they cross perceived racial lines of black or white. Another example would be the dilemma of a dark-skinned Puerto Rican who is perceived as black in Central Texas but viewed as Puerto Rican in New York City. Other examples include Irish, Polish, German, English, French, Scottish, Dutch, Swedish, Russian, Welsh, Portuguese, Armenian, and Norwegian are grouped together as white Americans. African including its varieties of black ancestry. Haitian, Jamaican, and depending on perceived racial features, those who are Hispanic or Latino are grouped together as Black Americans. Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Indian, Korean, and Vietnamese are grouped together as Asian Americans. The 567 indigenous tribes, which include the Cheyenne, Ojibwe, Crow, and others, are grouped together as Native or Indian Americans. Ethnic classifications. America has often been referred to as a melting pot, emphasizing the fact that the United States is a country that is made up of many races, ethnicities, and cultures. It is interesting to note that with migration at various local levels, systems of racial and ethnic classification and consciousness are not congruent with general principles. The melting pot metaphor described the United States as a refuge for all people who will come to this country is epitomized in the famous poem written by Emma Lazarus and engraved on a tablet within the pedestal on which the Statue of Liberty stands. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless tempest lost to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. This multicultural invitation and immigrant response to it has led to the melding of ethnic cultures. This melting represents an assimilationist model, the process of change a minority ethnic group may experience when moving to a country where another culture dominates. The assimilationist model suggests that minority ethnic groups adopt the norms of the dominant culture, just as the dominant culture assimilates aspects of the minority culture until certain aspects of both are no longer separate cultural units. That's one. One hypothesis is that ethnicity has aspects that are socially constructed, such as boundaries, identities, and cultures that are negotiated, redefined, and emerge as a result of social interaction within and outside ethnic communities. The most salient issue of ethnic identity is the issue of boundaries, which are continuously negotiated by members of any ethnic group. Ethnic identity is a composite of the view one has of oneself, as well as the views held by others about one's ethnic identity. Ethnicity, therefore, is a socially constructed model that stresses the fluid situational. Ethnicity, therefore, is a socially constructed model that stresses the fluid situational volitional and dynamic character of ethnic identification, organization, and action. That was fun. Ethnic identity is salient in various situations and with various audiences because every individual has a portfolio or layering of ethnic identities to draw upon. The U.S. Census not only demonstrates how people self-identify with a particular ethnic group, but it also demonstrates U.S. Census not only demonstrates how people self-identify with a particular ethnic group, but also demonstrates how self-identification changes through social interaction. Outside the group, the following examples demonstrate different levels of ethnic identification in many ethnic communities in the United States. So the various levels of ethnic identity available to Native Americans. Subtribal, tribal, regional, super-tribal, or pan-Indian. The most salient identity is dependent on the nature of the interaction. For example, on the reservation, an American Indian might identify as mixed blood. Or when speaking to someone from another reservation, the person might identify as being from Pine Ridge. Various labels of ethnic identity are available to Latino or Hispanic Americans. For example, an individual of Cuban ancestry may embrace varied identities based upon their interactions. The chosen ethnic identity is determined by the individual's perception of the audience, the social context, and the setting. For Asians, national origin, Japanese, Chinese, and Vietnamese remains an important basis of identification rather than a pan-ethnic identity. Among African Americans, the salience of a particular ethnic identification can be determined by context. At times, it is advantageous for dark-skinned Caribbean immigrants to acknowledge and emphasize color and common ancestry with African Americans. Other times, when the people of the Caribbean might highlight the distinctions between themselves and U.S.-born blacks. White Americans make ethnic distinctions as they negotiate their respective European ancestors, Italian, German, Polish, French, Irish, etc., or their Native American lineage may be more advantageous based upon the audience's perceived advantages of identifying as such. Ethnic consciousness, like race consciousness. Ethnic consciousness, like race consciousness, is informed by how aware members of the respective group and members of the larger society are of the ethnic differences that influence human interaction. There are both popular and social scientific understandings of classification membership. In spite of the social basis for ethnicity, in spite of the social basis for ethnicity. As is the case with race, there are still powerful consequences within society at large and within the workforce in particular. Race and ethnicity as both group and individual identities influence patterns of social conflict and the degree of opportunity available to various races and ethnicities. Discrimination. Some ethnic groups wish the font was bigger. Which font do I have right now? I had it on small. Now I have it on normal. This is better. Oh crap. Where was I at? Some ethnic groups have trouble gaining acceptance into American society because of their physical and cultural differences. The United States has experienced both peace and unrest because of ethnic differences. The Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement are both examples of conflict caused by ethnic difference. In particular, the Civil Rights Movement, a multi-ethnic effort, fought against discrimination in America's policies and practices against minority ethnic groups. In addition to discrimination, ethnic minority groups experience prejudice from the dominant culture, which devalues a group because of its assumed behavior, values, capabilities, or attributes. One of the results of discriminatory practices and prejudice against ethnic groups is stereotyping members of an ethnic group based on fixed ideas, often unfavorable, about what members of a group are like. Another form of exclusion is intrinsic racism, the belief that a perceived racial difference is sufficient reason to value one person less than another. Each of the examples causes individuals of minority ethnic groups to feel or become excluded for no other reason than their perceived differences from the dominant ethnic group. The differentiation between ethnic groups in the United States is between racial groups, cultural groups, and religious groups. A broader list includes politics, economy, religion, language, culture, and race. As differences, these characteristics can be used to classify an individual into a minority, ethnic status, or subordinate group by the dominant group. That minority ethnic subordinate group by the dominant group that results in discrimination, prejudice, and many negative effects on minority ethnic groups. For example, members of minority ethnic groups experience unequal treatment and have less power over their lives. than members of a dominant group have over theirs. The physical or cultural characteristics of the minority ethnic group can distinguish them from the dominant group. Color or language membership in a dominant or minority ethnic group is described upon the bearer born involuntarily into the group. When a group is the object of long-term prejudice and discrimination, the feeling of us versus them often becomes intense, strengthening of solidarity of the members in the group. The solidarity encourages marriage within the group and discourages marriage to outsiders. Finally, new immigrants may be perceived as lacking knowledge about the ways of working, being, and knowing in American culture. This therefore hinders their ability to be more formally accepted in American culture. Prejudice, discrimination, segregation, and even extermination create social inequality experienced by minority ethnic groups around the world. Ethnicity in the workforce. How does ethnic diversity that encompasses visible and invisible differences between subordinate groups in the dominant culture complicate interactions in the workforce? One way is the assumption that members of a specific ethnic group will share common values, behaviors, and worldviews. While there are similarities within ethnic groups, there must also be an awareness of in-group differences that are not always apparent or acknowledged by those outside the ethnic group. Additionally, while similarities are the fabric for weaving a sense of belonging within an ethnic group, they also nurture the perception of not belonging to the dominant group that causes exclusion. Studies on work groups have produced myriad theories, with race and ethnicity as the central variable under investigation. There are a few assumptions that have evolved to explain behavior from an individual and or within a working group perspective. Humans judge each other on subtle characteristics such as race or gender in the absence of additional information. Group memberships based on these characteristics implies true similarities or differences between people, which then creates the formation of in-group and out-group distinctions. These judgments ultimately result in outcomes that may have negative effects for minority or out-group members, e.g. lack of mentors, stalled careers, and lower performance evaluations or group productivity. Another perspective is that of value in diversity, which focuses on positive predictions or positive outcomes of racial and ethnic diversity. The underlying assumptions of this perspective are an increase in racial and ethnic diversity means that a work group will experience positive outcomes such as increased information, enhanced problem-solving ability, constructive conflict and debate, increased creativity, higher quality decisions, and increased understanding of different ethnicities, cultures. Surface level diversity such as race is indicative of deeper level differences such as cognitive processes, schemas, different general knowledge base, different sets of experiences, and different views of the world. These are especially salient in reference to workforce diversity. These are especially salient in reference to workforce diversity. Within the workforce, an understanding of the fluidity, variability, flexibility, and negotiability of ethnicity and race as a construct must become a part of our collective consciousness. This means that depending upon the cultural context and social situation, ethnicity may or may not be negotiable. When ethnicity does matter to people, it has the capacity to matter significantly and prompts them to action and give birth to extremely powerful emotions. Successful workplace diversity encompassing multiple ethnic groups must work to avoid circumstances leading to discrimination, prejudice, and stereotyping through education focused on building a deeper level of knowledge of minority ethnic groups. Common issues surrounding ethnicity in the workforce. Common issues surrounding ethnicity in the workforce. Ethnic consciousness, like race consciousness, is informed by how aware members of the respective group and members of the larger society are of the ethnic resources that influence human interaction. There are 4 common issues relevant to ethnic differences that have negative effects on ethnic minorities in the workforce. The first is language, which can hinder effective communication between management and employee group, management and consumer groups, employee groups in general, and employee and consumer groups. Perceived levels of social integration and communication skills can accelerate the frequency and intensity of conflict in the workplace. There is a growing insistence on requiring English as the official national language in the United States, which goes against the ideal that all races and ethnicities can come and ideally be accepted on their own terms, with their cultures, traditions, and languages being accepted as part of their identity. For many of them, English is a second or third language, and for some in the workforce, this may lead to misunderstandings and mistakes. Additionally, these communication problems may create an atmosphere for stereotyping ethnic group members as lacking intelligence and being incompetent. In the workforce, employees who speak a language other than English may be considered irritating to others outside that ethnic group. The very same people who would adamantly refuse to use racial slurs are comfortable with expressing anger towards coworkers who don't speak English fluently. Supervisors and managers should take the initiative to provide support for minority members who struggle with the English language by making inquiries as to whether the employee is interested in improving their English speaking skills and providing information, services, and financial support if feasible to connect employees to available resources. If the employee expresses no desire to learn and speak the language more fluently, managers should accept this decision and clearly explain any possible negative consequences that could affect potential advancement. Employers should be familiar with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission regulations regarding the kind of non-discriminatory working atmosphere that must be provided for all employees. Another issue related to language is accents, which also affects communication in the workplace. An accent is a mode of pronunciation such as pitch or tone, emphasis pattern, or intonation and characteristic of speech by a particular person, group, or locality. Unfortunately, an accent has been used as a reason for lower scores on evaluations and performance reviews in the workplace. Accents have also been used as criteria for determining the intelligence of a speaker and have been the cause of hostility and ridicule directed toward those who speak with an accent. When an employee has an accent that inhibits his or her ability to effectively fulfill the requirements of the job description, then action must be taken. The first step is to communicate clearly to the employee how problems are arising as a result of his or her accent. At this juncture, several alternatives could be explored, such as changing the person's responsibilities and/or providing him or her with training to reduce the accent. Ethnic jokes and ridicule are a common type of humor that can have negative effects on minority ethnic workforce groups. There are as many ethnic jokes as there are ethnic groups. Many jokes are the same, substituting different ethnic groups around the punchline. It is also common for employees to make fun of the mannerisms and accents, clothing, and hairstyles of coworkers who are from different ethnic groups. Ethnic jokes may be considered harmless in some company cultures and be overlooked or excused. However, just as racial and sexual humor is considered offensive and should not be tolerated in the workplace, neither should ethnic jokes. Ridicule of members of an ethnic group should not be tolerated. Often, the most effective method to combat offensive humor is to stand up and speak out against it. Finally, stereotypes are the most pervasive problem that ethnic minorities confront in the workplace. Stereotypes are usually distortions about various characteristics of a specific group. Of course, people often assume that every person within a particular ethnic group possesses these characteristics. For example, tall males from any ethnicity or race are often stereotyped by others as being proficient in basketball. African American men and women are often stereotyped as being good singers and dancers. Additionally, many African American men and women report firsthand experience of colleagues expressing genuine surprise at their ability to excel in the workplace, since academia conflicts with stereotypes. The most difficult aspect of stereotypes is that they're deeply ingrained in American culture. Stereotypes are so pervasive that they are generally accepted without question. One strategy to deal with ethnic stereotyping is to point it out and initiate a strategy for inquiry to determine its validity in the current case. It is important to consider claims of discrimination, prejudice, and racism on a case-by-case basis by resisting the urge to consider the claims of one group over another. Ethnic jokes and humor. and have negative effects on ethnic groups. Therefore, it is important to learn about an individual's culture and background first to avoid making ethnic assumptions. Stereotypes fade away over time with daily contact with ethnic groups. Employees must also be willing to speak up and out against ethnic insults and typecasting in the workplace when they occur. Ask international employees questions about their culture rather than make inaccurate statements that lead to stereotyping. International employees welcome the opportunity to share information about their culture with colleagues. Chapter summary. Although related to the construct of race. Although related to the construct of race, ethnicity is separate and has profound impact on interactions in the workforce. Ethnic groups are identified in relation to the dominant culture of the society in which they live, and their ethnic identity requires shared perceptions that there are within group characteristics there are within group similarities and across group differences. However, all persons within any particular group are not necessarily carbon copies of one another. In addition, ethnicity can only emerge in the context of relationships and interaction with others. Ethnicity is created and recreated based upon situations and the volition of the individuals engaged in the interaction with one another. In reference to workforce diversity, the characteristics of minority or subordinate groups in the United States are unequal treatment, distinguishing physical or cultural traits, involuntary membership, awareness of subordination, in-group marriage, and minority members lacking the knowledge about ways of working, being, and knowing in America. In American culture. It doesn't say whether the quizzes are open book or not. I assumed that they were not open book. Wait, maybe she said it in the announcement. Or did I say I assume they're open book? I assume they're not open book. Did she say they're not open book? I don't think she mentioned quizzes at all. Crap. Except for the late policy. Crap. She doesn't. It doesn't say. I thought it didn't it say like you're not allowed to use your book to take the quiz. Wait. I actually technically. That was funny. Is this open book or not? Ah. I can't. Did you say something about the quiz? It actually it doesn't say anywhere in the course if whether or not the quiz is open book. It doesn't say in the syllabus or the announcement, as far as I can tell. Pay attention to due dates. Has anybody asked a question about the quizzes here? Wait, actually, I wonder if people ask questions in like there's like a discussion thing where you can ask the professor questions. I'm actually going to seriously have to ask the professor about the quizzes because I didn't move it. Although maybe I should move it up to here. That makes sense. Move this over here. Oh, dang it. Let me just check the syllabus again. A 20-point quiz with 10 multiple choice questions is required for each unit. Come on, you still didn't say. It's actually kind of stupid if the course or professor doesn't specify that. It's obviously something students need to know. I'm just going to assume it's not open book, but I'll send an email just so I can maybe use my book for future quizzes. Seriously? Well, at least I've read all this stuff. Oh no, that weird noise was the final thing in the video.